Hi, in today's lesson, we will be making these really cool mini non-representational abstract sculptures made out of common household objects. They're really fun to make and really cool to look at, and there are so many different ways that these can turn out. So I'm really excited to get started on the art making activity. But before then, let's learn a little bit more about the differences between non-representational art, representational, and abstract art. Let's get started. Let's begin our first lesson. Communication through art. How do we communicate with art? What counts as communication? First, let's ask ourselves, what is communication? A simple way of defining it would be a means of sharing information or a message with one another. Communication is essential for human interaction and socialization. There are many ways we communicate with one another. The most common form, or the one we think of first, is written or spoken word. Sign language is a way that we visually communicate words. But what about concepts outside of language and phrases, like emotions or moods? The performing arts, like dance, theater, music, and visual, are all used as a means of communicating on a level that words cannot. But our focus today is on the visual arts. There are many approaches to defining art, but for the sake of this lesson, we will define art as the expression or application of human creative skill. We use art to communicate or express meaning or send a message to an audience. Throughout history, we see many examples of how art is used as a means of communication. For example, Egyptian hieroglyphs used visual icons to form messages or meaning, or to tell the story of the gods. The way subjects are portrayed was another way artists conveyed meaning. In Gonkai's emaciated horse, the horse represented the starving people under the ruler of their time. In Sophonisba's self-portrait, the artist wanted to emphasize her intellect as more important than beauty by portraying herself in simple colors and holding a book instead of portraying herself with elegant dresses, jewels, and hairstyles. Power was usually communicated in paintings of people using color, gesture, or posture. Kanagawa uses scale to communicate the terrifying power of the waves and ocean by portraying Mount Fuji as a small mountain in the background and the wave overwhelmingly looming over the mountain in the foreground. In this lesson, we will learn about three categories of art. The first is representational art. Representational or figurative art represents objects or events in the real world, usually looking easily recognizable. It portrays actual objects or subjects from reality. To put it simply, representational art is art that represents something which already exists in real life and is recreated by the manipulation of the art elements such as lines, shapes, color, tone, or value. In other words, representational art uses reality to influence how art elements are manipulated. Under the umbrella of representational art is abstract art. Let's begin our first. In abstract art, the aim is to take subjects away from reality and present them in a way that is different from the way they are viewed by altering elements such as lines, shapes, color, and form. Let's begin our first. In this case, reality is used as the influence, but the emphasis is on the art elements. Abstract art uses art elements to influence how reality is portrayed. The next category is non-representational art, which is often categorized and confused as abstract art. Let's begin our first. Non-representational art, or non-objective art, depicts shapes, colors, lines, and other elements of art to express things that are not visible, such as emotions, concepts, or even sensations. The aim of non-objective art is to create with no reference to reality and uses the elements and principles of art in a way that results in a visually stimulating work. Let's begin our art-making activity. We will be making mini, non-representational sculptures using a word of your choice. Here is a list of words you can use for your mini sculpture. It helps to sketch out your ideas first before getting started. The word I will use for this demonstration is light. The materials you will need for this project are wire. I bought this at Walmart for $3, so it's a really good price. But if you absolutely cannot buy it, you can also use a wire hanger that you might have at home, and it works just as well. You will also need wire cutters. I got this set at Walmart as well for a really good price, but the only one that you really need are the wire cutters. The other two tools you can use to bend the wires and get a good shape out of them, but they are not absolutely necessary to complete the project that we have. You will also need a wooden block. I got this one at Dollar Tree for $1. You'll also need a paintbrush and white gesso or clear gesso. You will also need scissors to be able to cut some of the material. Alternatively, you could also use clear glue or regular glue instead of the gesso. You will also need a staple gun or some kind of adhesive to connect the wire to the wooden block. The best choice is the staple gun because it is the most sturdiest. You could also use an industrial glue, but you would have to wait a while for it to dry out. And last, you will need pantyhose. The first thing that we're going to do is cut our wire to the desired length. The more wire that you cut, the more wire you have to work with, meaning that you could get more shapes or more curves out of your wire if you cut it longer. The shorter you cut it, the smaller your shape, or the less detail you're able to place on your shape for your abstract. I cut a medium-sized length for the word that I will be using, which is light. The next step is to put the ends of the wire onto your block and staple them together. Here I am folding the wire ends onto the block to be able to get a good sturdy shape out of the wire. Make sure to be mindful of the staple gun and to make sure to keep your fingers away from the ends. So there's my stapled wire. I'm bringing the other end to the other side. I'm not stapling them together really close because one of the things about creating a sculpture in any frame, whether it's a sculpture or ceramics, is to always have a really strong base. In this case, my base is the wooden block. However, when I put the wires on top, I also want the wires to be able to have a strong base themselves. So what I'm doing is I'm stapling them a little bit farther away from each other and not next to each other so that they can become an even stronger base. Here's what it looks like once it's attached. Now that I've got it attached, I'm going to go ahead and start shaping my wire. And since my word is light, I've already gotten some ideas and some sketches down on what I want to be able to have my sculpture look like in the end. And some of the words that I started using to be able to kind of come up with what my object will look like or my sculpture will look like, I started comparing and thinking about what light means to me in my head, or what I think light, if it were a tangible object, would look like. So when I think of light, I think something that is weightless, something that is um, kind of being pulled up by gravity, or I think about how the bones of a bird are hollow and it makes them lightweight to be able to fly. So those are some of the key things that I'm thinking about when I work on my sculpture. I did notice my base was a little bit loose, and so I went ahead and stapled it once more. And this is another thing to note is the importance of a strong base. So like I said, in any sculpture, the main thing that you want to focus on is having a strong base. If you don't have a strong base, then your sculpture is more than likely to fall apart. So again, you want to reinforce the base, and usually the wooden block, if it's heavy enough, will be your strong base in this case. However, it also does help for the wire to be attached to the block correctly for it to actually function as a base. Um, so now I'm just kind of working through and getting a kind of narrow base to my wire sculpture. The reason for that is just because, like I said, when I think of light, I think of this weightless kind of object or shape. And so what I wanted to do, and what I'm hoping to do by the end of this sculpture, is to get a sense of an object that is kind of becoming free or rising up from the bottom up, and just kind of getting that weightless feel. Another thing that I thought about was kind of the wings of a bird and how they kind of spread out. They start at one point and then they spread out um, further away from that point. And so that's kind of some of the ideas and shapes that I want to get into from this sculpture. But again, just remember that the shape that you make with your wire object is not going to be your final outcome, because we're still going to place a pantyhose over the wire, and so the shape is going to turn out a lot more different. So this is my wire right now. It's still being worked on. So now I'm just starting my shape, and this is now that I have a strong base, I'm ready to really work on my shape. And so like I said, I'm doing like the wings of a bird or getting the likeness of it. But I'm not necessarily making a bird, I'm not making wings, I'm just making different shapes that to me resemble something that seems lightweight, balanced, something that looks like it's floating up off of the ground. Um, and so I'm just kind of crunching in the wire, I'm just manipulating it, moving it around, and just twisting and turning. And really, I'm just intuitively kind of moving the wire around. So whatever your word is, you can just kind of mold your wire into different shapes that you feel it makes sense to your word. For me, like I said, I wanted the base to be very narrow and just kind of spread out to give it a sense of lightweightness. So there's the completed foundation. I'm pretty satisfied with it because it does look like kind of like wings or something kind of spreading out, or something that's kind of looks like it's taking off from the ground. So there's the base that I have for this. So now we can grab our pantyhose, and it doesn't have to necessarily be this kind of material. I just prefer this material because it's very stretchy and it can definitely get more shapes from your wire foundation that you build. But you can use a sock. The only difference is, like I said, this material is a lot more stretchier, and so it works better for this project. Whereas if you use a sock, it might put a strain on your wire, and you won't be able to keep the same shape that you had made with your wire. So the pantyhose is nice and stretchy, but it doesn't press on your wire, and so you're able to retain the shape. But you can do it with a sock if that is your only alternative. So now I'm just placing the pantyhose over the wire frame, and also placing it over the wooden block. And I'm just stretching it out a little bit so that it can fit over the shape and get more and retain more of the shape and not keep it wobbly. So that's what I'm doing. And then I get this kind of texture at the top, which I personally don't like, but I'm pretty sure we can make it work. But this is also something that can help you out if your word is, something that maybe you want to have that different texture that I have there at the top. That could be beneficial as something that will help you with your word. Or you can even move the pantyhose around and see what kind of shape or what other textures you might get. So that's what it looks like once I put it on. And I'm really liking the shapes that it's coming out to be. Um, I do think it took a little bit away from the lightweightedness that I was going for, but not so much that it changes the word. I really do like it. So now I'm going to just cut off a little bit of the excess at the bottom because it doesn't let my sculpture stand up straight. So I'm just going to cut a little bit off from the bottom, but not too much because I still want it to wrap around the block so that it can stay holding onto it and it doesn't come off. You can also go around and just staple or glue around the area to be able to keep it there and hold it, but I think it holds very well on its own, so I'm going to leave it alone. So that's what it looks like once it's been covered up. And I really like the shape and I really like the transparency that's going on. Um, I really would like to keep it like this, but I think it would also help to do some color on it. But I'm really liking the transparency that's happening with this. Next, we are going to apply our gesso to our sculpture. And I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up. And I'm going to also avoid the block because I do like the idea of my sculpture resting on a wooden base. I really like the texture of the wood and how it might contrast with my shape. But you are more than welcome to paint your bottom object as well. And you could even get creative with your base. I chose this block of wood because it was $1 at Dollar Tree, and I wanted to give you guys some cheap options that you have, but some other alternatives. If you have any wooden candle tops, I have plenty of them as well. And I feel like that's another thing that you could also use for your base is the tops of candles or anything really that's heavier than your wire is something that you can use. You can use different shapes if you have a ball that you might be able to use, although a ball might roll off and it won't be that sturdy for a structure on top of it. But you can do different shapes as your base and you can paint over them and you can get this completely different sculpture than I have. But I do have this wooden block that I use because I wanted to give you guys options and know that, if you go to Dollar Tree, this block is available there. But I also like the wooden texture of it, so I definitely kept that as part of the base of my sculpture unpainted. So this is what the sculpture looks like gessoed. Now we're going to let that dry. It's going to take a while for it to dry. For me, it took overnight for drying. And so this is what the sculpture now looks like after gesso. Now it's time to add color to our sculpture. Since my word is light, and not light as in the opposite of darkness, but light as in not heavy or lightweight, I decided that I wanted to go with a pastel color to give it that sense of lightweightedness or something that was more airy. And at first I thought about using baby blue, but I felt like that was too representational of the sky. Since it is a non-representational sculpture, I had to go with a different color that felt the same airiness or same lightweightness without seeming to represent the sky. So I decided to go with a pastel yellow, and I mixed yellow with white to get my pastel yellow. I did pour my paints onto a paper plate so that cleanup would be easier afterwards. So now I'm just going to apply the paint onto the sculpture. And what I'm doing is I'm not taking a big chunk of paint and just putting it on the sculpture. I'm getting small amounts of paint and just lightly brushing it onto the sculpture. and just doing it in small brush strokes. So I'm not applying heavy amounts of paint, because what happens is you get these clumps of paint and it makes your sculpture not come out smooth. So what I'm doing is I'm just lightly applying little bits of paint at a time, and I'm applying it with small, simple brush strokes and still being gentle. If you notice the sculpture is moving, it's because of how delicate it actually is, even after applying gesso. So that's why you want to be able to apply your brush strokes very lightly, and you can go back and forth with just small brush strokes. And like I said, I'm only grabbing small amounts of paint at a time. A little goes a long way. I managed to be able to cover much of the surface with only a little bit amounts of paint. And so, like I said, just going back and forth with the strokes, small brush strokes, trying to fill in any areas that might be difficult to apply the paint onto. And I'm not working on the base just yet either. I'm kind of working my way up and allowing the bottom to be free of paint to make sure that things are still clean and that I'm not getting my fingers dirty. Although, when you use paint, most likely you're going to get some paint on your fingers or on you one way or another. But this does minimize the amount of paint and the amount of mess that you'll have to worry about after cleaning up. There is a texture right at the top of my sculpture that I do have to work with, and I don't mind it because it adds a little something to my sculpture that I quite enjoy. So I'm gonna try not to cover too much of it up, but I am gonna try to evenly place the paint over it so that it's still covered evenly. But like I said, that you don't want to have clumps of paint over your sculpture, because that's what makes it look messy. Unless it's part of your word and you want to use clumps of paint. But again, it's a lot better and more intentional if you're applying your brushstrokes intentionally. And I think if you wanted to use clumps of paint onto your sculpture, I would recommend you start off with a nice smooth base first and then start adding your clumps later if that is something you wanted to do for your sculpture. But for me, I don't think clumps would imply any kind of lightweight or is appropriate for my word, so I'm going to try to avoid clumps of paint. I did have to be careful around the edges of my sculpture because this is where the paint wanted to clump up the most. So I had to go very delicately and very lightly on the edges so that I could get a nice even coat without the paint clumping and dripping on my sculpture. I left the base for last because if I had started on it first, it would have been difficult to maneuver the sculpture around. So now I'm going over the edges and I'm doing it from the top. And again, just light brush strokes, just move in one direction. I did think about painting my wood block, but like I said, I like the texture of the wood block. I like the separation from the wood to the sculpture, but if you wanted to, you could paint the wood block. So I'm just going around and very neatly applying paint to the edges using small brush strokes. So this is the sculpture painted. Like I said, I wanted to keep the base as a wooden texture block, but I am going to kind of even out some of the edges here on the block with a gold color. I initially wanted to also use a gold color for my sculpture, but I felt like gold was more of a heavy color because it does remind me of actual gold, and I feel like gold is heavy, so I didn't want to paint my entire sculpture gold because it would have made it seem a little bit heavier and it doesn't work with the word that I am using. However, you can come up with your own colors as well. I'm doing a gradient, and this is something you can also do. You don't have to stick to one color. You can also use other colors if your word requires it, or if you feel like you want to use different colors for the word that you chose. You can do gradients, you can do shapes even on your paintings, you can add textures, you can add polka dots. You could also incorporate other elements to your abstract sculpture as long as it makes sense with your word. Sculpt, since my object is supposed to be lightweight, I would use the heavier parts on the bottom and it kind of spreads out into this other shape at the top to kind of give it that not heavy feel. So that's why I'm using gold at the bottom and I'm making it into a gradient because I feel like I don't want the sculpture to suddenly just separate into two different colors. I did want it to be a gradual change. So to accomplish that, I decided to do a gradient. But like I said, you can do your own thing. You can separate your sculpture into two different colors if you wanted, or if it makes sense with your word. You could do different things with it, really. To make the gradient, I am just lightly and even lighter than I was before applying the color onto the shape and just kind of almost as light as a feather, just slowly, lightly using brush strokes to kind of even out and create that gradient. And then I'm applying a yellow paint again in the areas where I want it to be yellow and kind of lightly blending it with the golden color to get that gradient effect. And I feel like using this feathery texture with my paintbrush also gives it the idea of it being light. So I applied gold at the bottom and I did So I applied gold at the bottom, and if you notice, I applied a big amount of paint, which is exactly what we shouldn't do. But it sets as a good example to see what happens when you start applying too much paint. You start having to clean it up, and it gets all over the place, and it's hard to maneuver or it's hard to manage it. So you don't want to apply too much paint at once, or you're gonna have to be dealing with these gloops of paint, just like I am doing here. But no worries, it's an easy fix. You just scoop it up and just paint in the direction that you want it to go. And it is an easy fix, but you don't want to have to worry about it too much if you're applying too much paint. So I'm just continuing and just building up my gradient a little bit more so that the gold is a little bit more noticeable at the bottom. And again, I'm just using small brush strokes. I'm going up and down, up and down. I'm not moving side to side because I want the paint to go upwards into the sky almost to, again, work with the word that I'm using for the sculpture. Or if your base is already painted, you could just leave it as is and make it work with your sculpture. But again, the whole process is about making choices that make sense for the word that you are using for this sculpture. So here's my sculpture so far. I left my base as it was because I like the wooden texture and I like that the texture kind of makes it heavy at the bottom and lightweight at the top. I did have this curve going on to be able to kind of make it seem like it should be falling over, but because it's so light, it hasn't fallen over. And so you get the illusion that this must be a lightweight object if it hasn't fallen over. The paints that I did use were a metallic gold color and a canary canary yellow. Apologies for the paint, the purple paint on it. But these are the two colors that I used for the sculpture. I felt like my sculpture needed a little bit more texture on it, so I decided to get these yellow cotton balls and add them on with the clear glue. In order to keep things clean, I am applying the glue onto my sculpture with a paintbrush. And you can just create a little corner here on your foam plate where you can apply your glue. But what I have already is a little clear tub of glue that I'm going to be dipping my paintbrush in since I already have it pre-made. But like I said, you can pour your glue onto the foam plate that you have for your paints. So now I'm just going to apply the glue onto my sculpture, and when I'm applying the cotton balls onto the sculpture, I'm just leaving it pressed for a couple of seconds For me, it only took about a 5 second time frame, but if you wanted them to not to really hold on and really stick on, you might want to apply it and hold it down for more than 10 seconds, but it didn't last too long for me. Some of them you'll see here in a bit did fall off a little bit, so I just needed a little bit more time for the glue to dry and for me to hold onto the cotton ball onto the sculpture. But like I said, in order to avoid mess, I am using a brush and I am just, when I apply the paint, I scoop it up and I just twist a little bit to get rid of the little excess. And then I apply it onto my sculpture and just press on and hold it for about, for me, it was, like I said, 5 seconds. And I just leave it on. I also made the choice to have the cotton balls go in ascending order from the biggest at the bottom to the smallest ones at the top. And so when I was applying them, I kept in mind that I wanted the big ones at the bottom and the small ones at the top because I felt like that also was relevant to the word that I'm using this sculpture as. I felt like using the bigger cotton balls at the bottom helped with getting the word across through this sculpture, and having the smaller cotton balls at the top gave it that sense of, again, lightweightedness. I'm not even sure if that's a word. Oops, there it went. But that's okay. We can definitely just reapply that with some glue. So I just applied the rest of the cotton balls onto my sculpture, and I just kind of did it in random places, but I did apply the bigger ones to the bottom and the smaller ones to the top. Now you can definitely have so many different takes for your sculpture. You can do different colors, different bases. You can add different textures if you wanted to do, um, instead of cotton balls and you decided to go with something else, that is perfectly fine, as long as it's relevant to the word that you decided to use for your abstract sculpture. One tip, however, is if you're going to apply objects to your sculpture, make sure that they are not heavier. Make sure that one, they are not heavier than your base if you're applying it to the top, because it will throw off your sculpture and the balance of your sculpture. Remember, your base has to be the heaviest part of your sculpture for this to work. So you don't want to apply heavier objects to the top of your sculpture. And two, you don't want to apply objects that might be too heavy or stressful on your wire frame. Remember, it is still very delicate. It is made out of a sock and wire, so if you do apply maybe perhaps like a rubber band if you wanted to tie it down, just remember that it could alter the shape of your sculpture. Now, if that's something that you want, that's great. But if you are happy with the shape of your sculpture, you definitely don't want to apply anything that might alter that shape or change it in any way. So throughout this whole project, just remember that to think about the choices you are making. Definitely have a sketch of what you want to do. And most of all, have fun. Get creative. And that is the lesson for today. Next lesson, we will be going over communication typography.